If this planet is currently the only one with multicellular life and consciousness and a civilization, I would say it's the only planet where meaning exists in a galaxy. And we have a responsibility to protect it.
My name is Chris Packham, and I've been kindly invited to edit an Earth Day special of one of my favourite things, The Big Issue, one of Britain's greatest institutions, I would say. And as part of that process, I have the enormous pleasure of talking to Professor Brian Cox about life. I was reading, as I like to, Carl Sagan's essay about the pale blue dot last night. It's a beautiful piece of writing in which, as you know, he says that this is our home where everyone we've ever known and everyone we've ever loved has lived, and where every despot and creative has ever lived. And his implication, of course, is that it's of enormous value, despite the fact that when it was photographed, it was just a 0.12 of a pixel on the photo, a tiny little spot there hanging in those sort of sunbeams. The thing is, again, by implication, when I've always read that this is the only home we've obviously got, but what about other life? I mean, we often talk about protecting ourselves because we are the only known, at this point, the only known life in the universe. What are your thoughts on the fact that there is other life out there? I know that I think in the past, haven't you said you thought that there isn't other life out there?
No, I think there's a distinction. I think, and this is all speculation, right? It's guesswork. We, as you rightly say, there's only one place we know where life exists, which is Earth, and we've looked a bit. But I think the suggestion, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that life began pretty quickly on Earth, I think leads many people to guess that given the right conditions it will emerge elsewhere. However, there's a big difference between simple life, single-celled life, and multicellular life. And when we talk about particularly civilizations, but even a complex ecosystem, a biosphere that's beyond slime, right? Anything other than bits of slime around, then you're talking about multicellular organisms. Now, they don't appear in the fossil record until about, let's say, 650 million years ago or so. There's a bit of evidence from looking at genetics, actually, that maybe a billion years ago, the genes that code for body plan were around, so-called Hox genes, but not back before that. So what you see on Earth is that, yes, origin of life, 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, somewhere in that region. But then everything stayed single-celled for something like 3 billion years, which is a quarter of the age of the universe. Right, it's a long, long time, even in cosmological terms. So that perhaps tells us, the suggestion is that there's something in that change from single cells to multicellular life, obviously a prerequisite for consciousness, which is difficult, which took 3 billion years here. And actually, if you ask astronomers, not the question, how many Earth-like planets are potentially out there in the Milky Way galaxy, to which the answer is something like 20 billion, right? So something like 1 in 10 stars may have a potentially Earth-like planet. But how many of those were stable, by which I mean liquid water on the surface, stable climate, for 3 billion years or more? And the answer may be very few. So my guess, my working hypothesis, and this is my guess, is that there will be microbes all over the place. But if you're looking for complex life in an ecosystem, let alone civilizations, then I think that indeed we may be unique or one of a handful of worlds in the Milky Way galaxy. As Sagan said, it gives us a tremendous responsibility. In that essay you quote, The Pale Blue Dot, he says that help is not coming from elsewhere. Right? It's not. We cannot rely on the fact that someone is going to come to save us. Nobody is going to come to save us. We have a responsibility for this planet. And further than that, in my view, is that we may as well assume that we're the only planet with a civilization in the Milky Way galaxy at the moment. It's a reasonably sound assumption, but it's a very good political assumption. People talk about what does it mean to be human? What's the meaning of it all? Right? And meaning doesn't sound like a scientific term, but it really is. I think meaning comes from life. Right? A lifeless universe is a meaningless universe. A lifeless planet is a meaningless planet. I think meaning is local and temporary. Right? It emerges from this chemistry, this wonderful chemistry, and probably billions of years of evolution. And it's temporary. It will go away again. But that means that if this planet is currently the only one with multicellular life and consciousness and a civilization, I would say it's the only planet where meaning exists in a galaxy. And we have a responsibility to protect it. And I think that's my working hypothesis.
I like to say that we're one species at one time with one big problem and one chance to sort it out. Do you think at this point in time we're not acting as one species, clearly? How can we change that?
I think the process has begun in a sense, very slowly. You talked about Carl Sagan earlier. Carl Sagan always used to say that what we need is perspective. Perspective is a key element. He said astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. And that's what we've talked about. We've talked about the fact that the more we've explored, very, briefly, we're just beginning to explore our cosmic neighbourhood. But the more we've explored, the more I think we've discovered that it's possible, at least, that the Earth is very special. I know Sir David Attenborough tends to, or likes to say that his favourite environmental photograph, the one that he feels launched the modern environmental movement, was the Apollo 8 Earthrise photograph from Christmas Eve 1968, when for the first time we really saw the Earth as a fragile speck against the blackness of space and a barren lunar landscape. And so I think that we're beginning, because of the perspective we're beginning to get as we move off the Earth and consider our place in the wider universe, we're beginning to see that this place is special, which is a first step. So, but as you rightly say, we spend a great deal more money stockpiling nuclear weapons than we do attempting to understand our own ecosystem and our place in the universe, and attempting to understand climate change and so on. And so there's still a great imbalance. But I have some optimism in that if you go back to the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, and certainly if you go back to the time before space exploration and before we really thought about or understood our true place in the universe, then I think that we were even more myopic. I think the pandemic has, with some caveats, changed our relationship with science. It's remarkable that we went from, where are we now? Just the end of March. So just let's say 18 months ago, this virus did not exist in humans. And we've gone from discovering a new virus in humans, genetically sequencing it, and developing a series of vaccines which work against it in 18 months. It's absolutely remarkable. And so the way out of this pandemic will be that, right? It will be vaccinations. And then in future, because I don't think we'll eradicate this disease, it'll be in a combination of vaccination and treatments, all of which are developed using the method that I just described, right? The method of humility in the face of nature. The caveat is that I think that we see, of course, inevitably a politicisation of that process, in the sense that people are jockeying for position. Politicians across the world have been tremendously irresponsible. You see this spectre of vaccine nationalism raising, which is just not only morally but just practically idiotic, because you only need one country with an out of control spread of this virus, and the likelihood of mutations that evade the vaccination programs of all the other countries goes up rapidly. So I think what I hope is that when the fog clears and the inevitable politicisation of the successes and failures of science dissipates, and we have control of this particular pandemic, I hope that what remains when the fog clears is an understanding that the way it was defeated was through the generation of knowledge and expertise. And the generation of knowledge requires humility and global cooperation. And it's so self-evident in this case that I think that when the fog clears, that's what will be seen.
From my point of view, it's been an interesting year because many of the things that we had planned in terms of campaigning would have been inappropriate on account of COVID. So for us, it's been a time of reappraisal about thinking how we best communicate in what is now a changed world, to make sure that we hit the mark. We've got limited resources and obviously a limited amount of time to score points and successes. So it's important that we get it right. So I think that in some ways it's tempting to say that the environmental movement has been quiet for a year. But I hope that's not the case. I hope it's just simply been taking stock, and that when conditions allow, bearing in mind it's not just conditions, it's what's changed in people's minds on account of COVID and what they've experienced over the last 12 to 18 months, that we need to think again about how we communicate most effectively and how we pitch our messages. Because I think if we don't want to go back to the old normal in any way, shape or form, and certainly when it comes to our environmental campaigning, that I don't think that would work now. One thing that people have experienced in the last year is fear, and I think up until that point we developed a fear of fear, and yet fear is actually quite an important emotion for humans. I mean, fundamentally, it motivates them to fight or flight. But we've reacquainted ourselves with fear, and that might be part and parcel of our toolkit, in the sense that, if people are frightened about something and you offer them a solution, if you ring a bell, and that's all well and good, but I always say you've got to have the ambulance to attend the accident. And I think that now people have learned, reacquainted themselves with a bit of fear, then perhaps they might be a little bit more interested in the ambulances that we built to offer them help. And so that's one of the ways that I think we're going to change our pitch.